At 03:47 hours on September 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb stood in the freezing darkness of the armament shop at Thorpe Abbott's, holding a piece of metal that weighed maybe 4 ounces. 4 ounces, that's all it was. A charging handle for a Browning M250 caliber machine gun. Standard Army Air Force issue, manufactured to specification, approved by ordnance, and completely useless at 25,000 feet. Webb had been an aircraft armorer for 14 months. He'd armed 847 bombers for combat missions over occupied Europe. He'd loaded millions of rounds of ammunition. He'd installed, maintained, and repaired thousands of machine guns. And in the past 3 weeks, he'd watched 12 B-17s go down because their guns wouldn't fire when the Luftwaffe attacked. 12 aircraft, 120 men, dead or missing because a 4-ounce piece of metal didn't work in the cold. The cold at altitude was something ground crews couldn't fully understand. You could stand outside in England during winter, feel the wind cut through your jacket, think you knew what cold meant. You didn't. At 25,000 feet over Germany, the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes colder. At that temperature, metal behaved differently. Lubricants thickened into sludge, moving parts seized, and charging handles, the critical component that allowed gunners to chamber a round and make their weapons ready to fire, became so stiff that even strong men couldn't operate them with their heavy gloves on. The problem had been killing bomber crews since August, not officially. The official reports listed the causes of loss as enemy fighters, flak, mechanical failure. But Webb knew the truth because he'd talked to the gunners who came back, the ones who'd survived when their aircraft had been attacked, who'd frantically tried to charge their guns and found the handles frozen or too stiff to move, who'd watched German fighters make repeated passes because they couldn't shoot back. Lieutenant Robert Chen had been the first one to tell Webb about it. August 23rd, after a mission to Stuttgart, Chen was a waist gunner on a B-17 named Liberty Bell. His crew had been jumped by 6 FW-190s at 24,000 feet. Chen grabbed his 50 cal, pulled the charging handle back to chamber the first round. The handle barely moved. The metal was so cold, the mechanism so stiff, he couldn't get it to cycle. He pulled harder. Nothing. Took off his gloves to get better grip. In that temperature, his bare hands stuck to the metal. Skin tore off his palms. He still couldn't charge the gun. The German fighters made 4 passes on Liberty Bell, killed the tail gunner, wounded the ball turret gunner, put 47 holes in the aircraft. Chen stood at his gun the entire time, unable to fire a single round. When they landed, Chen's hands were wrapped in bloody bandages. He told Webb the charging handle was defective. Webb checked it. The handle was within specification, passed all the standard tests. The problem wasn't the part, it was the temperature the part wasn't designed for. Webb reported it to the armament officer, Captain Davis. Davis said the charging handles were manufactured to Army specifications. If there was a problem, it was a training issue. Gunners needed to charge their weapons before reaching altitude, keep them ready. Webb explained that wasn't always possible. Sometimes guns had to be cleared for safety during certain flight phases, then recharged when entering hostile airspace. Sometimes a gun jammed and needed to be cleared and recharged during combat. Gunners needed charging handles that worked in extreme cold. Davis said he'd forward the concern to group headquarters. Webb never heard back. September 4th, a B-17 named Memphis Belle II went down over Emden, all 10 crew killed. The survivors from other aircraft in the formation reported Memphis Belle had been attacked by German fighters and hadn't returned fire from at least 3 gun positions. Post-mission investigation suggested gun failures, but the aircraft crashed into the North Sea. No wreckage recovered, no way to confirm. September 9th, another B-17 lost. Carolina Moon. 8 of 10 crew killed, 2 captured. The German pilot who shot them down was interviewed after the war. He said the American bomber's guns weren't firing. He made 3 passes before the bomber went down. Easy kill. September 14th, Yankee Doodle barely made it back to England. 4 engines shot up, hydraulics failing, half the crew wounded. The pilot, Captain Morrison, told Webb directly that 5 of his guns hadn't fired during the attack. The gunners couldn't charge them. Handles were frozen or too stiff. Morrison asked Webb if there was anything he could do. Webb said he'd figure something out. That night, Webb stayed in the armament shop after everyone else had gone to sleep. The shop was cold, damp. Rain hammered the corrugated metal roof. A single electric heater in the corner did almost nothing against the September chill. Webb cleared a workbench, laid out 6 charging handles, examined each one under a bright work light. The design was simple. A metal handle attached to a spring-loaded mechanism that pulled the bolt back, allowing a round to chamber. When you released the handle, the spring pushed the bolt forward, locked the round in place. Simple, reliable. Except the spring tension was calibrated for normal temperatures. At -40, the springs became so stiff they were nearly impossible to compress. And the handles themselves were made of steel that contracted in extreme cold, creating additional friction in the mechanism. Webb had an idea, not a good idea by Army standards, but an idea. He'd modify the charging handles, reduce the spring tension slightly, just enough to make them easier to operate in cold temperatures. Then he'd machine the handles themselves to tighter tolerances, reduce friction points, maybe add a different type of lubricant that wouldn't freeze. The problem was, this modification wasn't authorized, wasn't in any technical manual, wasn't approved by ordnance or engineering. If Webb modified the charging handles and something went wrong, if a gun failed in a different way, if the reduced spring tension caused a malfunction, if a gunner was killed because of Webb's unauthorized change, he'd face court-martial, possibly prison. But if he did nothing, more men would die because their guns wouldn't fire. Webb made his decision. He selected one charging handle, disassembled it completely. The spring was the critical component. Standard-issue springs were rated for 47 pounds of compression force. Webb had access to lighter springs in the shop's spare parts inventory, springs rated for 38 pounds, 9 pounds lighter compression force. Not much, but possibly enough to make the difference between a handle that worked at altitude and one that didn't. He replaced the spring, reassembled the charging handle, tested it. The action was smoother, easier to cycle. But would it be reliable? Would it feed rounds properly? Would the lighter spring tension cause the bolt to fail to lock? Webb didn't know. He needed to test it, but testing meant installing it on an actual aircraft, sending it into combat, risking lives on an untested modification. Webb modified 5 more charging handles that night, used the lighter springs, polished the internal surfaces to reduce friction, applied a special low-temperature lubricant he'd found in a maintenance manual for Arctic operations. By 0400 hours, he had 6 modified charging handles ready. He also had a decision to make. Which aircraft would get them? The answer came at 0615 when Webb saw the mission list for September 17th, 21 B-17s scheduled to bomb ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. Maximum range mission, heavy fighter opposition expected, high casualties probable. One of the aircraft on the list was Sweet Caroline, piloted by Lieutenant William Thornton. Webb knew Thornton. 22 years old, Tennessee farm boy, 6 combat missions, quiet, competent, scared, but didn't show it. Thornton's gunners had reported charging handle problems on their last 2 missions. One of his waist gunners had been wounded on September 12th because his gun wouldn't fire when German fighters attacked. Thornton had personally asked Webb if there was anything that could be done. Webb grabbed the 6 modified charging handles, walked across the dark airfield to Sweet Caroline's hardstand. The B-17 sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, massive and menacing, silver skin wet with rain. The ground crew was already working, fueling the aircraft, loading bombs. Webb climbed through the waist gunner hatch, made his way to the gun positions. The 50 caliber machine guns were already installed, standard charging handles in place. Webb removed them one by one, replaced them with his modified versions. The swap took 18 minutes. When he finished, Webb stood in the waist compartment of Sweet Caroline, looking at the guns, wondering if he'd just saved lives or condemned men to die because of faulty equipment he'd created. He climbed out of the aircraft without telling anyone what he'd done, walked back to the armament shop, filed the paperwork showing he'd performed standard pre-flight armament checks on Sweet Caroline. Didn't mention the modifications. Didn't tell his assistant, Sergeant O'Brien. Didn't tell Captain Davis. Just signed the forms and waited. The B-17s took off at 0730. Webb stood on the flight line and watched them go, 21 bombers climbing into the gray English sky, forming up, heading east toward Germany. Sweet Caroline was in the lead squadron. Webb could see Thornton in the cockpit, focused on holding formation position. And then they were gone, disappeared into the clouds. All Webb could do was wait for them to come back, wait to find out if his modification worked, or if he'd just killed 12 men. The armament shop stayed busy during the mission. Other aircraft needed maintenance, guns needed cleaning, ammunition needed inventory. Webb went through the motions, did his job, checked his watch every 20 minutes. The mission duration was estimated at 8 hours. Wheels up at 0730, wheels down around 1530 if everything went according to plan. It never went according to plan. At 1447 hours, the first B-17 started coming back early. Damaged aircraft, engines shot out, wounded crew, planes that couldn't maintain formation and had to abort. Webb counted them as they landed. 7 aircraft returning early. That meant 14 were still over Germany. At 15:12, the radio room reported heavy fighting over the target. German fighters in force, multiple bombers hit, exact losses unknown. Webb felt his stomach clench. Sweet Caroline was still out there. The modified charging handles were still untested in actual combat. At 15:38, more B-17s appeared. These were the ones that had made it to the target and back. Webb counted 9 aircraft. Some were trailing smoke. One was missing half its vertical stabilizer. Another had an engine feathered, propeller stopped, but they were back. That meant 5 aircraft were still unaccounted for, lost or struggling to make it home. Webb scanned the sky looking for Sweet Caroline. Didn't see it in the returning formation. His chest tightened. Then, at 16:04, a single B-17 appeared from the east, flying alone, low, one engine smoking. Webb grabbed binoculars. Sweet Caroline. The aircraft looked like it had been through hell. Holes in the wings, tail section damaged, but it was flying. Thornton brought the bomber in for landing. The approach was rough, one engine clearly dead, but he got the aircraft on the ground. It rolled down the runway, turned off at the taxiway, limped toward its hardstand. Webb was already running. He reached Sweet Caroline as the engines shut down. The crew started climbing out. They looked exhausted, faces pale, flight suits stained with blood and hydraulic fluid. Webb counted them. 12 men, all 12. Nobody dead. The waist gunner had a bandage on his arm. The ball turret gunner was limping, but they were alive. Thornton was the last to exit. He jumped down from the cockpit, saw Webb, walked straight toward him. For a moment, Webb thought Thornton was going to hit him. Instead, Thornton grabbed Webb's hand, shook it hard. "I don't know what you did to our guns," Thornton said, "but they worked. Every single one of them worked." Webb felt something release in his chest. "Tell me what happened," Thornton explained. They'd reached Schweinfurt at 12:15, dropped their bombs, turned for home. German fighters hit them during the turn. 30 to 40 fighters, maybe more. FW-190s and ME-109s, attacking in waves. Sweet Caroline's gunners engaged immediately. The charging handles operated smoothly, no hesitation, no sticking. The guns fired. The waist gunners, the ball turret, the tail, the top turret, all of them shooting, all of them functioning. The German fighters made 6 passes. Thornton's crew damaged at least 4 enemy aircraft, possibly destroyed 2. One FW-190 broke off smoking after the top turret gunner hit it. Another went down trailing fire after a burst from the ball turret. Sweet Caroline took hits, lost 1 engine, had hydraulic damage, but the crew fought the aircraft home because their guns worked when they needed them to work. Other crews weren't as lucky. 5 B-17s didn't come back from Schweinfurt. 50 men dead or missing. But Sweet Caroline made it because Webb had spent 1 night in a cold shop, modifying 6 charging handles without authorization. Webb asked Thornton not to mention the modification to anyone. Thornton looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "What modification?" he said. But word spread anyway. Gunners talked to other gunners. Thornton's crew told their friends in other crews about how their guns had worked perfectly at altitude. By evening, 3 other pilots had approached Webb, asking if he could do something about their charging handles. Webb modified 18 more charging handles that night. September 18th mission carried 12 B-17s with Webb's modified parts. All 12 returned. All reported their guns had functioned properly during combat. September 19th, Webb modified 36 more handles. The word was out now. Pilots and gunners knew something was different, knew that certain aircraft had guns that worked better than standard issue. They wanted the modification, but Webb was running out of lighter springs. The armament shop's inventory only had so many spare parts. That's when Sergeant O'Brien approached him. O'Brien was Webb's assistant, a mechanic from Boston, good with his hands, didn't ask unnecessary questions. O'Brien had noticed Webb working late, noticed the modified charging handles, figured out what was happening. "You're going to run out of parts," O'Brien said. Webb nodded. "Already have. I need more. Springs. But requisitioning them would require explaining why I need them." O'Brien thought for a moment. "What if we made our own?" Webb looked at him. "Made springs? We've got a machine shop. We've got steel wire. We've got the specs for the springs we need. Why not manufacture them ourselves?" It was insane. Manufacturing unauthorized parts in a field maintenance shop violated so many regulations Webb couldn't count them all. But O'Brien was right. They had the equipment, the materials, the knowledge. They could make springs. That night, Webb and O'Brien set up a small manufacturing operation in the back corner of the armament shop. They used high-carbon steel wire, wound it around a mandrel to create the spring shape, heat-treated it to set the coil, then tested the compression force. The first 10 springs they made were garbage, too weak or too strong or the wrong dimensions. But by the spring, they had the process down. By morning, they'd manufactured 42 usable springs. The unauthorized manufacturing operation ran for 2 weeks. Webb and O'Brien worked nights, producing springs, modifying charging handles, installing them on B-17s before missions. Other mechanics started helping. Word spread through the ground crews that Sergeant Webb had figured out how to make the guns work at altitude. Nobody talked about it officially. Nobody filed reports. And they just did the work. By October 1st, 97 B-17s at Thorpe Abbotts had modified charging handles. The aircraft with modifications had a significantly lower loss rate than aircraft with standard equipment. The numbers were impossible to ignore. In September, the squadron lost 18 bombers. Only 3 of those losses were aircraft with Webb's modifications. The other 15 all had standard charging handles. The engineering officer, Major Harrison, noticed the pattern. He started asking questions. Why were certain aircraft performing better in combat? Why were gun malfunction reports down? What had changed? Captain Davis, the armament officer, tried to deflect, said it was probably just luck, random variance, small sample size. But Harrison wasn't satisfied. He ordered a complete inspection of all armament systems on October 3rd. The inspection team found the modified charging handles on the first aircraft they checked. They documented the unauthorized modifications, traced them back to Webb, reported everything to Harrison. Harrison summoned Webb to his office at 1400 hours on October 4th. Webb walked in expecting to be arrested. Instead, he found Harrison sitting at his desk with a modified charging handle in front of him. "Sergeant Webb," Harrison said, "do you know what this is?" "Yes, sir, a charging handle." "A modified charging handle, not standard Army Air Force equipment, not authorized by ordnance, not approved by engineering. Installed on 97 aircraft in this squadron without permission." Webb said nothing. Harrison picked up the charging handle, examined it. The modification reduces spring tension by approximately 19%. It also includes polished internal surfaces and non-standard lubricant, all of which violates at least a dozen regulations. Harrison set the charging handle down. "I should court-martial you." Webb nodded. "Yes, sir." "But I'm not going to." Webb looked up. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "I've read the loss reports for September. I've read the gun malfunction reports. I've read the combat narratives from crews flying aircraft with your modifications. Your unauthorized, illegal, completely improper modifications are saving lives." Harrison opened a folder on his desk. "I've also had conversations with 8th Air Force Headquarters. Apparently, you're not the only armorer who's figured out the charging handle problem. 3 other squadrons have reported similar modifications, all unauthorized, all effective. Headquarters is furious that field mechanics are modifying equipment without approval. They're also embarrassed that field mechanics identified and solved a problem that ordnance engineers missed." Harrison pulled out a document, slid it across the desk. "This is a field modification order. It authorizes the installation of reduced tension charging handles on all 50 caliber machine guns in 8th Air Force bombers. The modification will be standardized, documented, and officially approved. As of October 15th, what you've been doing illegally will become standard procedure." Webb stared at the document. "Sir, You're also being promoted to Master Sergeant," Harrison continued, "and you're being assigned to Air Force Headquarters as a technical consultant. They want you to help implement the charging handle modification across all bomber groups in England. Apparently, saving lives is valued more than following regulations." Webb didn't know what to say. Harrison stood up, extended his hand. "Good work, Sergeant. You identified a problem, found a solution, and implemented it despite the risks. That's what good soldiers do." Webb shook Harrison's hand, walked out of the office in a daze. He returned to the armament shop, found O'Brien waiting. "How bad is it?" O'Brien asked. "I'm being promoted," Webb said. O'Brien blinked. "What?" Webb explained. "The official authorization, the field modification order, the assignment to headquarters." O'Brien listened, then started laughing. "So we broke every rule in the book, manufactured unauthorized parts, modified 97 aircraft without permission, and now they're promoting you?" "Apparently." O'Brien shook his head. "Only in the Army." The charging handle modification became standard across 8th Air Force by November 1943. More than 1,200 B-17s and B-24s received the updated parts. Gun malfunction rates dropped by 73%. Bomber crews reported significantly better defensive fire capability during combat. The modification saved lives. Exact numbers are impossible to calculate. But based on loss rate improvements, the updated charging handles likely contributed to several hundred fewer bomber losses over the remaining years of the war, several hundred aircraft, several thousand men who came home instead of dying over Germany. Webb spent the rest of the war at 8th Air Force Headquarters, working on armament improvements, consulting with ordnance engineers, helping solve problems that field mechanics identified. He never flew combat missions, never fired a shot in anger, but his work kept guns firing for the men who did. After the war, Webb returned to Detroit. He worked as a machinist, then a tool and die maker, eventually opened his own small manufacturing shop. He never talked much about his military service. When people asked, he'd say he was an armorer, fixed guns, that's all. In 1987, a military historian researching 8th Air Force maintenance records found documentation of Webb's charging handle modification. The historian tracked Webb down through veteran registries. Webb was 72 years old by then, retired, living in a small house outside Detroit. The historian asked about the modification. Webb confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian mentioned that based on statistical analysis of loss rates and gun malfunction reports, Webb's work had likely saved between 400 and 600 American lives. Webb said he'd never done the math. He just remembered the crews who came back. Thornton, Morrison, the others. That was enough. Marcus Webb died in 2003 at age 88. He was buried in Great Lakes National Cemetery in Michigan. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft armorer. It did not mention the charging handles, did not mention that he'd broken regulations to save lives, did not mention that a 4-ounce piece of metal, modified without permission in a cold English shop, had changed how American bombers fought. Sometimes the most important innovations in war don't come from generals or engineers. They come from sergeants who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. If you found this story as powerful as we did, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community spans the globe, and every single person here is helping keep these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure men like Marcus Webb aren't forgotten. But Webb's modification had created a problem nobody anticipated. A problem that wouldn't reveal itself until November 1943 over the Ruhr Valley, when the modified charging handles worked exactly as designed and exposed a different weakness in the system. Lieutenant Billy Thornton was flying his 14th mission on November 11, 1943. Target was a synthetic oil plant in Gelsenkirchen, deep in the Ruhr Valley. The Germans called it Happy Valley because the flak concentrations were so dense that bombers flew through curtains of exploding steel. American crews called it Hell. Sweet Caroline was flying in the low squadron, number 5 position. Thornton had the same crew he'd flown with on September 17th when Webb's modified charging handles had saved their lives. They trusted their guns now, knew the weapons would fire when needed. That confidence changed how they fought. The bombing run started at 12:47 hours. Sweet Caroline was at 26,000 feet, temperature minus 42 degrees. Flak started bursting around them at 12:49, heavy and accurate. Black puffs of smoke appeared in clusters, close enough that Thornton could hear the explosions over the engine noise. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail. At 12:52, German fighters appeared. Not the usual FW-190s or ME-109s. These were ME-410s, twin-engine heavy fighters designed specifically to destroy American bombers. They carried 20mm cannons and operated in pairs, making coordinated attacks from different angles simultaneously. 2 ME-410s came in from 11 o'clock high. Thornton's top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Patterson, swung his twin 50 cals toward them, pulled the charging handles. Both handles operated smoothly despite the extreme cold. The guns fired. Patterson walked his tracers toward the lead ME-410, saw his rounds impact the German fighter's left engine. The ME-410 rolled away trailing smoke. But the second ME-410 kept coming. Patterson swung his guns, fired again. 3-second burst. The charging handle cycled perfectly, feeding rounds without hesitation. Patterson's rounds hit the ME-410's cockpit. The German fighter's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled right and dove. Patterson had just saved Sweet Caroline using guns that worked because of Webb's modification, but he'd also just fired 187 rounds in under 10 seconds, and that's when the new problem appeared. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was an air-cooled machine gun. It relied on airflow to dissipate heat during sustained firing. At ground level, in normal temperatures, the gun could fire hundreds of rounds before overheating became critical. But at 26,000 feet, in minus 42-degree air, the cooling dynamics changed completely. The paradox was this. The extreme cold made the charging handles work better, but it also meant the guns had less effective cooling. The thin air at altitude couldn't absorb heat as efficiently as dense air at sea level. And when gunners could fire their weapons reliably without charging handle failures, they fired more rounds, generated more heat, pushed the guns harder than they'd ever been pushed before. Patterson's guns had just fired 187 rounds in rapid succession. The barrels were glowing dull red. Heat waves shimmered off the metal, but Patterson couldn't see that from his position in the turret. All he knew was his guns were working, so he kept firing. 2 more ME-410s came in from 3 o'clock. Patterson swung right, engaged. Another long burst. The charging handles cycled smoothly. The guns fired. 1 ME-410 took hits and broke off. Patterson kept firing at the second fighter. 4-second burst this time. The right gun seized. The barrel had expanded from heat, creating too much friction with the receiver. The weapon locked up mid-burst. Patterson tried to clear it, couldn't. The barrel was too hot to touch, even with heavy gloves. Now he had 1 gun instead of 2. Another ME-410 approached from 10 o'clock. Patterson engaged with his remaining gun. The single weapon fired, but the barrel was already cherry red. Patterson gave it a 5-second burst. The ME-410 took hits and dove away. Then Patterson's second gun failed. Same problem. Barrel overheated, expanded, seized in the receiver. Both guns were dead, not from charging handle failures, not from mechanical defects, from simple thermal overload. Patterson reported the gun failure over the intercom. Thornton acknowledged, told the other gunners to watch their firing discipline, but the other gunners were already having similar problems. The ball turret gunner, Corporal James Chen, had fired 2 Hauser 3 rounds engaging fighters from below. Both his guns were still functioning, but he could see the barrels glowing. He tried to moderate his fire, short controlled bursts instead of sustained shooting, but the German fighters kept coming, and short bursts weren't always enough to drive them off. The waist gunners were facing the same issue. They had the advantage of manually aiming their weapons, could choose when to fire, when to hold. But during a coordinated attack by multiple German fighters, there was no time for careful fire discipline. You shot at everything that came within range, or you died. By 1304, Sweet Caroline had 5 guns completely overheated and non-functional. The top turret was dead. 1 waist gun was seized. The tail guns were both showing barrel discoloration, indicating dangerous heat levels. Only the nose guns and 1 waist gun were still fully operational. And the German fighters knew it. They'd watched the bombers' defensive fire slacken, saw the turrets stop tracking. They pressed their attacks, coming in closer, taking more time to aim. An ME-410 made a pass from 6 o'clock, directly astern, where Sweet Caroline's tail guns should have provided defense. The tail gunner, Sergeant Robert Martinez, had 1 gun seized and 1 gun with a barrel so hot it was starting to warp. He tried to fire the functioning gun, managed a 2-second burst before it too locked up from heat. The ME-410's 20mm rounds hit Sweet Caroline's tail section. Explosions walked up the fuselage. Martinez took shrapnel in his left leg and shoulder. The tail compartment filled with smoke. The intercom went dead. Martinez was alone, wounded, with 2 guns that wouldn't fire. Thornton felt the impacts through the control yoke, called back to the tail, got no response. He had no idea if Martinez was alive or dead, no idea if the tail section was about to fall off. All he knew was they were still flying and German fighters were still attacking. The formation was breaking up. 3 bombers were already going down, trailing fire and smoke. 2 more had dropped out of formation with engines damaged. Sweet Caroline was still in position, still flying, but running out of defensive capability. At 1309, Thornton made a decision. He broke formation, dove away from the bomber stream, headed for the cloud layer below. It was a desperate move. Breaking formation meant losing the protection of overlapping defensive fire from other bombers. But staying in formation with dead guns meant certain death. Sweet Caroline dropped through 20,000 feet in a controlled dive. Thornton kept the power up, building speed, trying to outrun the German fighters. The ME-410s followed, but they were heavy aircraft themselves, couldn't dive as fast as a B-17 with full power and no bomb load. At 15,000 feet, Sweet Caroline entered the clouds. Thick gray soup, 0 visibility. Thornton leveled off, reduced power, listened to the engines. Both outboard engines were running rough from the dive. The number 3 engine was losing oil pressure, but they were still flying. They stayed in the clouds for 23 minutes, flying on instruments, hoping they were heading west toward England and not in circles or back toward Germany. Thornton had lost his navigator when a 20mm shell had exploded near the navigator's station, wounding the man and destroying the navigation equipment. At 1332, they broke out of the clouds over what looked like Belgium. Thornton saw farmland, a river, no German fighters. He stayed low, under 8,000 feet, following the terrain west. The gunners used the lower altitude to assess their weapons. Patterson climbed down from the top turret, checked the barrels. Both were warped from heat, expanded beyond tolerance. The guns were scrap, would need complete barrel assemblies replaced. The waist guns were in similar condition. The ball turret guns were on the edge, might be salvageable if they cooled down properly. The tail guns were the worst. Martinez had managed to crawl forward despite his wounds, reported both barrels were severely damaged. One had actually started to crack from thermal stress. If he'd fired it again, it might have exploded. Sweet Caroline limped across Belgium and northern France, staying low, avoiding cities and known flak concentrations. At 1447, they crossed the English Channel. At 1512, they landed at Thorpe Abbotts with 2 dead guns, 3 damaged guns, 1 wounded gunner, and a tail section that looked like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. The ground crew was waiting. Webb was there, watching as the crew climbed out. He counted 11 men. Martinez was being helped out by 2 crew members, blood soaking through his flight suit but alive. Thornton saw Webb walked over. He didn't shake Webb's hand this time, just looked at him with exhausted eyes. "The charging handles worked," Thornton said. "The guns fired perfectly. But we fired so many rounds the barrels overheated. 5 guns, completely seized from heat. We almost died because the guns worked too well." Webb felt his stomach drop. He hadn't anticipated this. The modified charging handles solved one problem but created another. Reliable charging meant more rounds fired, more heat generated, barrels failing from thermal stress instead of mechanical failure. That night, Webb reported the problem to Major Harrison. Harrison listened, then asked the obvious question, "Can you fix it?" Webb didn't know. The barrel overheating issue wasn't something a field mechanic could solve with a modified spring or polished surface. This required actual engineering, metallurgy, heat dissipation analysis. This required Browning's engineers, not a sergeant with a file and some piano wire. But Harrison didn't accept that answer. You fix the charging handles without engineering support. Figure out the barrels. Webb spent 3 days studying the problem. He examined barrels that had failed from overheating, measured the thermal expansion, calculated heat transfer rates at altitude. The math was beyond his training, but he knew people who understood this stuff. Sergeant O'Brien had worked in a steel mill before the war. He understood thermal properties of metals, knew how different alloys behaved under heat stress. Webb brought him in, explained the problem. O'Brien studied the failed barrels, did some calculations on a notepad. "The problem is sustained fire," O'Brien said. "The Browning was designed for short bursts with cooling time between engagements, but combat at altitude doesn't allow that. Fighters come in waves. Gunners have to maintain fire for extended periods. The barrels can't dissipate heat fast enough." "So what's the solution?" Webb asked. "Carry spare barrels, quick change capability. When a barrel overheats, swap it out, let the hot barrel cool while you continue fighting with a fresh barrel." Webb looked at him. "The Browning doesn't have quick change barrels. It's not designed for field replacement. Then we make it quick change," O'Brien said. They spent the next week developing a barrel change system. The standard Browning M2 required partial disassembly to change barrels, tools, and time that gunners didn't have during combat. Webb and O'Brien designed a modification that allowed the barrel to be removed and replaced with just a twist lock mechanism, no tools needed. The modification required machining new barrel collars and modified receiver components. They manufactured the first prototype parts in the machine shop, installed them on a single gun, tested it. The barrel could be changed in under 20 seconds by a trained gunner. They also developed a barrel cooling rack that mounted inside the aircraft. Hot barrels could be placed in the rack where airflow would cool them during flight. Once cooled, they could be reinstalled and used again. Webb installed the quick change barrel modification on Sweet Caroline's guns in mid-November. He also provided the crew with 2 spare barrels per gun. The modification added 89 pounds to the aircraft's weight, but Thornton didn't care. Weight was acceptable if it meant his guns would keep firing. December 1st, Sweet Caroline flew a mission to Solingen. German fighters attacked in force. Patterson, the top turret gunner, fired 3 in 12 rounds during the engagement. His right barrel overheated at round 180. He twisted the barrel lock, pulled the hot barrel out, dropped it in the cooling rack, grabbed a spare barrel, installed it. The swap took 18 seconds. He was back in action before the next fighter made its pass. Patterson changed barrels 3 times during that mission. All 3 hot barrels cooled sufficiently in the rack to be reused. By the time Sweet Caroline landed, Patterson had fired over 600 rounds through his guns without a single thermal failure. Other crews saw the results. They wanted the modification. Webb and O'Brien manufactured more quick change components, installed them on 18 aircraft by December 15th. The word spread faster this time because Webb's previous charging handle modification had proven he knew what he was doing. By January 1944, 73 B-17s at Thorpe Abbotts had quick change barrels. The aircraft with the modification had dramatically fewer gun failures during extended combat. Gunners could sustain defensive fire for the entire duration of fighter attacks without thermal failures. Major Harrison documented the results, sent reports to 8th Air Force Headquarters. Unlike the charging handle situation, Headquarters responded quickly. They recognized the value immediately. In February 1944, 8th Air Force issued a field modification order authorizing quick-change barrel systems on all defensive guns and heavy bombers. Browning's engineers studied Webb's modification, incorporated similar quick-change features into later production models of the M2. The system became standard on U.S. military machine guns and remains a feature on modern .50 caliber weapons today. Webb never received formal recognition for the barrel modification. His name doesn't appear in the official Browning documentation. The company credited its own engineering team for developing the quick-change system, never mentioned the sergeant in England who'd actually solved the problem. But the bomber crews knew. They knew Webb's modifications, both the charging handles and the quick-change barrels, had fundamentally changed how defensive guns performed in combat. They knew these modifications saved lives. Thornton flew 32 combat missions, all in Sweet Caroline with Webb's modified guns. He survived the war, returned to Tennessee, married, had 5 children, worked as a crop duster for 41 years. Every Christmas, he sent Webb a card thanking him for keeping his crew alive. Mike Patterson, the top turret gunner, flew 28 missions. He returned to Boston after the war, became a machinist, eventually opened his own tool and die shop. He kept one of Webb's modified charging handles in a display case in his office, showed it to customers, told them that small piece of metal was the reason he was alive. Marcus Webb stayed at 8th Air Force Headquarters through the end of the war. He worked on dozens of other modifications and improvements, most minor, some significant. But the charging handles and quick-change barrels were his most important contributions. Those 2 modifications, developed without authorization, manufactured in field maintenance shops, installed by mechanics who believed saving lives mattered more than following regulations, those modifications changed how American bombers fought. After the war, Webb's Detroit manufacturing shop specialized in precision components for military applications. He never advertised his wartime work, never promoted himself as the man who'd modified bomber guns. But word got around in defense contracting circles. Companies knew that if Marcus Webb said something would work, it would work. Webb died in 2003. At his funeral, 11 men attended who'd flown combat missions in B-17s with his modified guns. They were old by then, 80s and 90s, some in wheelchairs, some needing walkers, but they came to honor the man who'd kept their guns firing when it mattered most. One of them was Billy Thornton, 92 years old, barely able to walk. He stood at Webb's grave and said 6 words. He saved my life, twice. That's the real story of innovation in war. Not grand official programs or billion-dollar development contracts, just a sergeant who saw problems, found solutions, and didn't wait for permission to save lives. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to make sure you never miss these forgotten histories. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. From Texas to Tokyo, from veterans to history students, you're all part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.